This is The Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Before you do anything else, please subscribe to my new YouTube channel at youtube.com/the @ and then The Reason Interview. That's youtube.com/the Reason Interview. My guest today is Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, a best-selling champion of Enlightenment values. Lord knows we need that. And a staunch critic of identity politics and the woke left. We talk about whether DEI mandates and the anti-free speech forces on campus are really being rolled back in higher education since last fall's election. And we talk about the new threats to academic freedom and independent thinking the Trump administration poses, not just to Harvard, but every other college and university. In a moment when many public figures and public intellectuals are calling for a religious revival, Pinker makes the unapologetic case for secular humanism as the foundation for a flourishing society. And he also previews his forthcoming book on common knowledge, titled When Everyone Knows, and out in September. The book explains everything from political revolutions to moral panics to why sleepy Joe Biden finally bowed out of the 2024 race. Here is The Reason Interview with Steve Pinker. Steven Pinker, thanks for talking to Reason.
Nice to talk to you, as always.
Let's start off by I want you to take a victory lap, maybe a short one, but in December 2023, you wrote for the Boston Globe a 5-point plan to save Harvard and, by extension, higher education. The things you were saying, and this was in the wake of, a couple of decades of kind of weird drift towards very authoritarian kind of left-wing, extreme positions on a bunch of things, as well as the October 7th, the backlash on campuses or the celebration of the October 7th invasion of Israel. But you were saying like Harvard needs to, defend free speech, start doing institutional neutrality, have nonviolence on campus, viewpoint diversity should be encouraged, and there should be a disempowering of DEI. At least half of that agenda has been achieved at Harvard. There seems to be a new free speech sensibility here. They have adopted institutional neutrality, and DEI statements among faculty have been gotten rid of, right?
The mandatory diversity statements by job applicants in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
So let's start with that. I mean, are you happy about the progress that you've seen, just in the past couple of years?
I'm happy with the progress. Too soon to take a victory lap. We're committed to, have always been committed to academic freedom, but there are still abuses. A colleague of mine had a course, a biologist of reproduction, had a course in which students were encouraged to take both sides of the controversy on whether natal males should be allowed to compete on women's sports teams. The General Education Committees kind of called them on the carpet, saying, no, you can't give that to our students.
Well, because you can't do both sides of that issue.
Yeah. Oh. As if there only is one side.
Right.
That would just be one example of how we're not there yet. But at least it's on people's lips. Even Claudine Gay, the embattled Harvard president,
former
Harvard president, but her inaugural speech had a paragraph endorsing academic freedom, including for opinions that make people uncomfortable. So we're not completely there yet, but at least it's been advocated as an aspiration.
The troops will be home by Christmas. Something like that, right?
Something like that, yes.
It's Vietnam circa 1968
We've
rather
seen
than 62.
The light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. Or where people admit defeat and withdraw.
So I think it has. I think it will put some of the deplatformers and the cancelers on their back foot, in that the conversation has changed. So academic freedom is a thing, and what had previously been buried in a spiral of silence, that if you speak out against that, well, that itself could get you canceled. I think that silence has been shattered. So at least it's out there.
Has Harvard, they lost the case about admissions and using kind of affirmative action, or rather maybe not affirmative action as much as kind of the games that they were playing to disallow Asian students
de facto.
like become.
They wouldn't frame it that way.
But I mean, they lost that case and
Yeah.
said at UNC, a public college. Has that had any effect on either who gets admitted or like what campus life is like and intellectual life?
Not yet. It might, and in fact, there is suspicion that universities will find clever workarounds, such as personal experience statements in which I think this was a loophole allowed by the Supreme Court decision, you could indicate how your own life experience makes a Harvard education especially relevant to you. And that's basically a way of saying, I'm an African American.
Right.
So there will be various loopholes. And I think there's a feeling, even among those of us who are opposed to hard racial preferences, that there is something desirable about not having 1% of the student body be African American.
Right.
At a flagship elite university, or just for the experience of our own students and faculty. So,
what do you think about, one of the ways that I guess the Ivies started getting around when Jews started showing up in large numbers, they started imposing geographical diversity, maybe not requirements, but expectations. And that kind of makes sense, right? Like you want to hear from Ezra Pound, who was born and raised in Idaho, right? Or T.S. Eliot from St. Louis. I mean, how do you match those kinds of interests in diversity and then also ideological diversity? Well, because that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. So ideological diversity is almost the raison d'etre of a university. Not because every viewpoint is equally valid, but just because at any given time, most of us are going to be wrong about most things, and we won't know it because everyone loves their own ideas.
Right.
So the idea of academic freedom and more important, intellectual diversity is just, I think, baked into the mission of a university, which is pursuing the truth.
Right.
You can't pursue the truth.
And if I'm remembering correctly, because I'm a visitor here, but Harvard's motto is veritas, right? So it's truth, right?
You've seen it emblazoned.
I've seen it on
our
T-shirts
seals.
all over the place.
Yes, right. And there's no
On
shortage
homeless people throughout Boston, I see veritas.
There's no shortage of hawkers of those T-shirts, and then Harvard's intellectual property lawyers are all over them.
Okay.
But they're all arguing over who gets to sell a T-shirt with Veritas on it. So
I guess answer this. Harvard is simultaneous. It's the oldest university in America, and it generally has the reputation of being the best overall. Comprehensive university, and there are rankings where sometimes it's number 2 or 3, and in FIRE's free speech list, it's usually at 0.
2 years in a row, yeah.
But it is simultaneously a great university, and it was one of the most extreme kind of institutions that were captured by extreme progressive ideas that shut down freedom of speech, that kind of valorized violence on campus, things like that. How does that happen?
Oh, you mean
or like should we think lesser of Harvard if in fact it had gone this extreme in a way? Like why does it keep ranking so well?
Well, in prestige or poorly in academic freedom?
Yeah, in academic freedom and free speech, I get that. But how can it be both, right?
Yeah. Partly it's because as much as I love my friends at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and I myself have used our last place ranking to great advantage in internal deliberations to get the attention of our deans and presidents and provosts saying, look, we're number 0. Right. We got to do something. So it's been a very handy propaganda tool.
They're just like, as long as Princeton is also 0, it's okay. Let's not worry about it.
Well, but having said that, there is some hyperbole there. I'm doing fine at Harvard, and I've expressed plenty of politically incorrect opinions, and a lot of my colleagues have as well. And the vast majority of what people do at Harvard is not foist postmodernist critical theory, intersectional social justice on our students. That happens, but there are people who are studying ancient DNA and asteroids and the Grimm's fairy tales and the stories of Jorge Luis Borges. So there's a lot of scholarship and teaching that goes on. That's most of what goes on. It doesn't go viral, but that's kind of what most of us do. I mean, most days.
A university is ultimately known by its faculty, right? Which then attracts the students. But
But most of the activities really, and so a lot of the Harvard's reputation is deserved in the sense that there are really smart, interesting scholars here. There's a lot of mediocrity at Harvard as well.
Do you want to name some names?
Of course.
You're in a giant building named after William James. There must be dozens of mediocrities in this very building.
I will exclude this building for the people that I rub shoulders with. But the problem is precisely because Harvard has that brand, it can often coast on its reputation. And sometimes it is the smaller schools who are more nimble about expanding into new frontiers, for example.
You have also recently signed an open letter, an editorial that was talking about threats threats to academic freedom or academic excellence, really, in higher education, both from within the academy and from without. Talk about what you mean by that, and let's start with what are the major or to back up, and I apologize for starting here, but it seems like the free speech stuff is that vibe shift is kind of associated with Donald Trump becoming president, or at least Kamala Harris losing. And now we're talking about free speech at universities. Donald Trump has obviously threatened to withhold a certain amount of federal funding from Harvard unless the institution capitulates.
Not a certain amount, all of it.
Yeah. And Columbia has already kind of said, you know what, your requests make a lot of sense. This gave rise to, simultaneously more free speech on campus maybe, but then also threats about federal funding and things like that. So could you summarize what you're getting at in the open letter about threats to higher education?
Yeah, it was a signed op-ed. It wasn't really an open letter by the presidents of academic freedom councils at Columbia, Princeton, and Harvard, all of which it turned out had been targeted with the threat of withdrawal of federal funding.
And Harvard, the figure that gets bandied about, it's like $9 billion to Harvard and affiliated institutions over a multi-year period. That's like the federal money that's on the table.
That's the federal footprint, yes. And it includes, say, the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, which specializes in pediatric cancer research and treatment. So on the, it puts us in a bind in that a lot of the things some of the things they were demanding were things that we ourselves have been pushing for, some of which have already been implemented. When the government says, like Vito Corleone, your signature's on the contract or your brains are, then that is actually something of a nuisance in that when we do something that we were going to do anyway, it looks like we're capitulating to what is almost certainly illegal federal blackmail. That is, there are procedures by which the government can put strings on funding of research, all of which were flouted by the administration.
What's an example of that?
Of what they were?
Yeah, of like what is a legitimate constraint that the government can put on research that it funds versus one that is,
well, take the most extreme example. In the early 1960s, there were universities like the University of Alabama that just would not admit African American students. And the federal government said, not only are we not going to fund you, but we're going to send soldiers down. So if there are well-stated criteria, like you can't discriminate against students, you can't bar the door as a condition for receiving federal funding, I think everyone's fine with that. It's taxpayer money. There are principles of higher education. When it comes to micromanaging which departments get put under receivership or how disciplinary procedures are going to be handled bureaucratically, then that kind of micromanagement is, we think, an unwarranted intrusion.
Is that what's on the table when Trump's Department of Education says you can take this money and you will you'll follow these procedures for, say, like Title IX sexual assault charges,
which was of course under the Obama administration.
So I mean, how is this categorically different what the Trump administration is demanding of universities, or is it kind of, what the government is always doing?
There is some overlap. So, and there was There was protest when the so-called Dear Colleagues letter from the Obama administration on the prosecution of sexual misconduct cases came, especially from our law school, which knows a thing or two about due process and has some commitments that things like confront your accuser, know what the charges are, have access to representation, and they pushed back. They ultimately lost, but this was the nose of the camel into the tent, perhaps, and the list from the Trump administration is far more extensive.
Yeah, what are examples of that?
That there have to be, the university must outlaw students from masking at demonstrations, that the disciplinary procedures must be centralized in the president's office. In the case of Columbia, the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies be put under receivership. There's a long list of demands that, as opposed to the single domain of sexual misconduct from the Dear Colleagues letter. Also, there was not, this was issued as a set of preconditions for negotiation with no assurance that federal funding would be restored if the university complied. So this really was extortion rather than the
how is Harvard going to respond? Because they haven't quite responded yet. I mean, I guess Columbia folded.
Which, as predicted, wasn't good enough. They didn't. This is, I think, a closely guarded secret. So far, Harvard has not resisted by filing lawsuits, which some of my colleagues in the law school say they are entitled to file. That is, there really were breaches of the law in terms of how the government could announce and negotiate and enforce what it saw as violations. And in this case, since the pretext was protecting students against anti-Semitism, and it wasn't like George Wallace standing on the door. It's not as if our Alan Garber is saying no Jews, Jews out of Harvard today, tomorrow, and forever. And this is clearly also. It can't overtly be stated. It's obviously a pretext. The university, the administration has not shown that it is committed to combating anti-Semitism in all its forms, and it may be like slapping sanctions on Canada for failing to halt fentanyl.
It is our oldest enemy, right? Canada.
That's right.
So it's like it makes sense. Why you mentioned The Godfather when you're talking about Don Corleone talking about contracts that your names or brains are on. Why doesn't Harvard, which the endowment is how big?
$53 billion.
Okay, so it's like bigger than most countries. Why don't they pull a Mo Green and say, like, you buy me out, I buy you out? Like, why doesn't Harvard just say, fuck you to the federal government? We can pull it from our existing cash pool and new donors who would probably fund that.
As I recall, Mo Green was shot in the eye on the massage table.
Yes, that's right.
So that's part of
and
the
also
answer.
played by an Italian. It's The Godfather is endlessly confusing because half the Jews are playing Italians and half the Italians are playing Jews.
I'm going to contact the Anti-Defamation League.
Yes.
For that.
So,
the answer that we had been given for decades was that the 80% of the endowment is earmarked for specific uses. I'm the Johnstone family professor of psychology because the Johnstone family said, here's money to endow a chair in mind.
Who was Johnstone?
Johnstone is Bruce Johnstone. It was the manager of Fidelity Investments Equity Income Fund and many other.
And do you have to do therapy sessions for the Johnstone family?
I have a lovely lunch with the Johnstone family every year.
So most of the endowment is supposedly restricted.
Yes.
But
or
we know that
you've
got the greatest lawyers on the planet. They can work around those restrictions.
Well, so we were told by our former president, Larry Summers, in the New York Times last week, who said, speaking as a former president, I can assure you that there are ways of getting around that. Nonetheless, there's a lot of federal money, and it's in perpetuity. And if Harvard ate its seed corn, then that would not be a sustainable policy over the long run.
Do you, and this might be something that we broadly might disagree on, is one of the ways that federal funding for things like science and research, basic research, and that can include in things in the social sciences and even the humanities, do you feel like if the federal government didn't do things, it wouldn't happen?
I suspect it wouldn't happen at the scale that it does. Yeah. There's just not there, since it is the benefits are very risky and very long term. I think philanthropy can be a good adjuvant to federal funding, and it has been in cases like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Wellcome Trust in Britain, but it can't substitute for the federal
Are
government.
you persuaded by studies, and I'm thinking there's a series of studies done by the OECD in the early 2000s that talked about sources of economic growth? Because one of the ways that federal funding in the sciences and kind of technology, engineering, and obviously the history of ag schools in America, which came out, state-funded agriculture and mining technical schools, became part of the federal government, or the federal government started funding them in the 1860s, is that they are powerful engines of economic dynamism. The OECD has done a series of reports that show that in terms of sources of economic growth, there isn't a lot of correlation between high levels of public spending on research compared to private R&D, and that the more the government tends to fund, the less private sources do that. Do you find that at all compelling or relevant?
So I'm not aware of that study. I mean, I am aware of data possibly propagandistic, that every dollar of federal funding of research returns, I forget what
That's
it was,
always a lie. The multiplier effect is always oversold by who's ever selling.
What we do know is that certainly ever since the federal government got heavily into the research funding business at the end of the Second World War, there has been spectacular American dominance of basic scientific research as measured in Nobel Prizes, scientists who want to come here, and of course fantastic technological and economic growth. Now that's correlation, not causation. Right. I suspect that at the scale at which research now has to be done, that it's unlikely that private sources could make up for it.
I mean, there's people like the, and I'll mispronounce her name, Catalin Carico, who helped develop the mRNA vaccines and, won a Nobel Prize for that. She's one of the examples that people use where she had a position at Temple University, got hired by UPenn, which is the dream of all Temple professors, and then got blocked there because she wasn't getting enough taxpayer grants, and then went to private industry where she actually did the essential work. And that's used as a proxy for this kind of thing, that private sector R&D tends to be bigger and more effective.
Well, I think that's why there's an important role for private sector philanthropy for research, as there is for in philanthropy in general, including global philanthropy. Just governments are beholden to political considerations, but just the sheer scale of what the government can do is going to dwarf private philanthropy, and private philanthropy is also at the whims of the billionaires and the foundations funding it, whereas certain things in the public interest, at least in theory, the federal government could do. And even in the case of Carico, what was it? Carico, yes.
And again, that's a mispronunciation.
No doubt. But her particular innovation was sitting on a vast infrastructure of research on genomics and molecular biology and virology and so on. So it's not as if she started from scratch.
Are you worried that, rehearse quickly the history of what happens when governments, or states, regardless of their explicit orientation, when they start dictating the direction of higher education in a jurisdiction?
So this is I think this is an extraordinarily important and not well understood issue of not only the federal intervention, but the converse of faculty governance and the mechanism by which professors get hired and promoted and grants get awarded, namely peer evaluation. On the one hand, you really don't want politicians dictating what can be taught or studied. On the other hand, when you have professors conferring prestige on each other as the coin of the realm, there is the built-in danger that you can get self-referential loops of people congratulating each other. And I think especially
we used to know this as the Oscars, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And the Oscars can happen in universities
Right.
and does happen, especially in fields where the objective criteria for success are elusive. When it comes to a number of private sector activities, if the company is losing money, the CEO gets fired. Right. If the NBA team loses, the coach is fired. At least in the sciences, I like to think that there are some pretty objective criteria as to whether your experiments work, whether you're in engineering, does the bridge fall down. In the social sciences, and particularly in the humanities, it's less clear what excellence consists of. And when you have excellence being determined by a clique of people who are both the conferrers and the recipients of prestige, there is the danger that they can get trapped in their own intellectual monoculture. How to balance those two considerations, that the experts should be making decisions in their areas of expertise. On the other hand, the experts themselves may become unmoored from objective merit as an unsolved problem. In theory, universities have external visiting committees where departments and centers are evaluated every few years by a committee assembled by the overseers of the university, who are themselves elected by the trustees, by the alumni, And they're supposed to report back to the dean. This department is sinking in quality. There are a bunch of cronies. It's kind of intellectually corrupt. In practice, like a lot of regulatory bodies, they get captured by those they regulate, and they're kind of cronies of the professors. So it's perhaps a mechanism that ought to be strengthened in order to have some legitimate external feedback as to whether an academic discipline is doing what it ought to be.
Does that also, part of that gets built into reputation, right? And if universities, if they're giving each other awards in a way that makes them seem really great, but it's detached from wider discourse communities, those institutions tend to suffer, right, reputationally.
Yeah. And here, by the way, in saying that, I am kind of a traitor to my caste, my clique, because most professors are just adamant that faculty ought to govern the university, and that any external voice that's what they define as an infringement of academic freedom.
Do you, the Soviet Union, one of the few things it produced in abundance were negative examples of how to order society, right?
Yes.
And, the idea that when politicians start to dictate what is considered good higher ed, what is good science, that never ends well, does it?
That does not end well. No, that's exactly. And this is the tension that has to be resolved, and I don't think that either side has done a good job as yet.
Well, and is part of it because, do you have a sense, I'm assuming, are you an American citizen, or do you vote? Okay. Yeah, I assume you did not vote for Donald Trump.
I did not vote for Donald Trump.
So you voted for Chase Oliver, the Libertarian candidate, obviously?
Obviously. He's from Alt.
Yeah. Do you worry that the Trump administration is uniquely anti-intellectual and is interested in destroying higher education, or is it more it's a strain of intervention that the Obama administration was calling certain shots? Is this where does Trump and his current orientation towards higher ed? Where does that fit into your worldview?
I think that it's qualitatively different. As we see in the appointment of a crackpot as the Secretary for Health and Human Sciences.
That's Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as we see in the imposition of tariffs that no thinker in their right mind could endorse. There's a lot of just pleasure in watching things burn. So I think we are dealing with a different kind of intervention.
With Kennedy, what's your, he's in charge of Health and Human Services, so he's going to, he oversees the FDA, he oversees a lot of scientific, or policy setting and research money and things like that. What most concerns you about his reign?
Certainly the sowing doubt about vaccines, vaccines being perhaps the best thing our species has ever done.
Especially now that White Lotus season 3 was such a disappointment, right?
Especially, yes.
Yeah.
The I think the kneecapping of public health agencies, the massive firing of record keepers, data gatherers, which could lead to irreversible gaps in our knowledge. The foisting of a holistic nutrition agenda, which
but if the government exists, if a core function of government isn't to tell us what to eat every meal, well, come on, what is it?
That's right.
It's mere anarchy, is what
and of course, Thomas Jefferson was adamant about that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence.
He had a lot of crazy ideas. So, but then what about people? I mean, are you buoyed by people like Jay Bhattacharya at the National Institutes of Health or Marty Macri at FDA, or I mean,
Jay Bhattacharya, I think is I think is a reasonable choice. Although, if he's going to be settling scores, and he's got plenty of scores to settle, that's probably not the most productive way to run the NIH. And just an attitude of delight in chaos, of applying a chainsaw for the sheer fun of destruction. I think governments, for all their problems, like any institutions, are finely tuned contraptions, and that generally chainsaws aren't a good way to improve them.
Yeah. You're in that op-ed, you talked about threats from without, and that's, kind of the Trump administration. It's also true confidence in higher education has really taken a hit, particularly among self-identified Republicans. Yeah. But more broadly, I mean, there does seem to be I was going to say crisis in higher education, but I'm sure every decade going back to about the 1500s, there's dozens of books written about the crisis of confidence in higher education. But it does seem as if we're at a point now where larger numbers of people are saying, you know what, higher education is kind of a racket. People aren't learning things, or it's not justifying its existence. Does it feel at all different to you than, I mean, you've been teaching now for years. So.
Yeah, it feels different. And the polling data show that it is different, that we're almost as unpopular as journalists.
Yeah, welcome to the club. Lowered expectations can be quite liberating.
Well, yes, that's right. That's the bright side. And it's a combination. And when the polling data are broken down, it's a combination of the exponential rise in costs, which people partly and correctly attribute to an increase in administrators.
Right. It's not well as federal funding. The idea that, like, if there's bigger pots of money that the federal government is giving to people to go to college, colleges are like, hey, we can raise prices.
Yes, exactly. Combined with what is correctly seen as imposition of a left-wing orthodoxy, the viral incidents of speakers being shouted down, of professors being mobbed by students shouting obscenities, and then being praised by the university president to take a notorious example.
Well, I think
Yale.
The 60s taught us that the children really shall lead us, right? And that they're the wise ones, that's us old people with our stuffy ideas.
That was well established.
Yeah.
And those incidents, even if they're not representative, they're conspicuous enough that, and in fact, they do represent a real strain in universities where they're just not doing what they're empowered to do, which is discover the truth and pass along knowledge.
Are you worried at all about, there is also a kind of anti-intellectualism in this critique where, and I'm thinking it's not always from the right, it's sometimes from the left, but where people say, well, you know what, universities aren't giving people like access to high-paying jobs anymore, or the only thing universities should teach are STEM, engineering classes, because everybody makes $100,000 when they graduate as an engineer.
Yeah,
and that strikes me as kind of weird thing to think about higher ed as like the ultimate vote tech program.
Yes, right.
And that seems to be rising.
That does seem to be rising, although it's always been there, and professors in particular always deplore it. I don't think it's unreasonable that students want to, they'd rather be in the middle class, the upper middle class, than in the lower class. And there may be some skew that a lot of university education is being applied to no real purpose. And perhaps even in the case of a lot of money-making master's programs,
Right.
where a lot of money is being drained from students' wallets in exchange for dubious benefit for the students. But yeah, there is some anti-intellectualism behind it, which is pernicious when it bubbles up to actual decision making, and we have know-nothing policies, such as we've just seen with trade, such as in public health.
Yeah.
Just in any domain, it's for all the problems with experts, ignoramuses are unlikely to be better.
Yeah. Do you worry about activist alums, or where do they fit into this? And I'm thinking, because we're at Harvard, Bill Ackman, who was a billionaire that very few people knew until he really got exercised over the response of Claudine Gay to the October 7th attacks, and he is now he was defending Trump's tariffs and then walking away from them, et cetera. But he's an example of, he stands in for a type, and and it can vary. Like, is that new? That kind of public denouncing of a institution by famous, super rich, and we assume influential alums?
I think that's new. A historian of the American University might correct me. There may have been past instances. Actually, there are always. I should correct myself there a bit. There are always irate alumni who write in. I remember when I was at MIT, the president at the time, Chuck Vest, says every week or so I get a letter from an alumnus telling me to fire Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
So I think the thing is that those alumni aren't quoted by the New York Times,
right? Or they're not on Twitter,
and they're not on Twitter,
exactly. Millions of people.
And here, I don't think it's unreasonable for our alumni to weigh in. They are stakeholders. They have the Harvard degree, and they want it.
They've got the T-shirts.
They've got the T-shirts. And here again, I'm somewhat of a traitor to my guild in saying that input from our alumni is not necessarily bad, that if it's just professors deciding what professors can do, there's just the built-in danger of capture and corruption. I don't think it should be that. And likewise, I don't think that donors should be disenfranchised. If there's going to be voluntary support of the university, the donors should have a voice, just like I withhold money from charities that I think have departed from their mission.
So how do universities kind of writ large, how do they change this dynamic where it seems like people have less trust and confidence in institutions? There's broader and broader critiques that seem to start saying, no, we're going to have outside forces change how universities work, whether it's the government or alumni or something, because that becomes a problem. Like, if you become known as a school that is run by whoever is giving you the most money at a given point in time.
Yeah, you don't want that either.
Yeah. Like, what are the ways forward?
The question is, how can there be voice without control? Especially, you don't necessarily want to apply a greater voice to the richest donors, because they have a right to their opinion. But the fact that they're billionaires doesn't mean that their opinion ought to count for more. So part of that would just be delicate balancing. You hear them out, but don't do what they say. As it is with the balance of internal expertise applied to evaluation with outside voices that prevent capture and corruption. So I don't know exactly what the answer is. I'll tell you what part of the problem is that I don't think the ultimate governance of the university is particularly rational. We have a corporation shrouded in mystery. I had, and a couple of colleagues had dinner with them, and the New York Times wrote about the fact that the corporation actually had dinner with Harvard faculty.
I didn't know corporations are individuals. You can have dinner with them, right? They can vote, and they own property, etc.
Well, there is the legal fiction that they are persons, but in addition, they actually are flesh and blood people. We had dinner with two of them. They actually ate in front of us, so we know that they are corporeal. But the most of the people who ultimately run Harvard are from big corporations or big law firms. There are a couple of former university presidents. I am guessing they have outsized voice because they actually,
Well, they have
give it down.
expertise.
They have
too,
expertise,
right?
and they have. It's not just something on their resume, but it is rare that a board of trustees or a corporation articulates the mission for the university for which they hire the president to carry it out, and then, if necessary, replace the president if he or she isn't implementing it, as opposed to just getting into some scandal or generating unfavorable headlines. So the chain of command, who's ultimately the fiduciary of the ultimate goal of the university, namely creating and transmitting knowledge, and seeing to it, having the president's back and seeing to the president actually implements it, that doesn't exist, or at least it's not salient enough.
Yeah.
So we have university presidents often wondering whether the trustees or the corporation has their back, and not particularly given a mandate other than to keep the university out of the papers, or at least to minimize negative headlines.
Yeah.
So ultimately, if there is a mission of any institution, the buck's got to stop somewhere. Someone's got to be ultimately responsible for implementing it, and that doesn't happen.
In preparing for this interview, I came across an article that talked about 15 books you recommended for everybody should read. What was interesting about that was one of the books was written by your wife, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, by Rebecca Goldstein, which is a fantastic series of kind of fictional chapters that are fantastic. But I wanted the only person who had multiple books on the list was Richard Dawkins. You also, Richard Dawkins, the great evolutionary biologist and atheist. He did a farewell tour in America that you were one of his interviewers on. He went to, I don't know, a dozen or two cities around the country. Why you picked two books by Dawkins, An Appetite for Wonder and The Blind Watchmaker.
Actually, I think wasn't it The Selfish Gene?
It was not in the list, but obviously Selfish Gene is probably his best-known work.
Yeah.
Right? Talk a little bit about what does Dawkins' legacy mean to you? Like why is he so important a thinker?
Well, The Selfish Gene, his first and as you know, best-known book.
And that's like 75 or 76,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
It's a radical book. Still, I think its lesson is still unappreciated, which is that the essence of natural selection is that it consists of competition among replicators, and therefore adaptations, complex features of an organism, wings and eyes and feathers and hearts and brains, are ultimately for the benefit of the replicator being the gene. And the reason that is a radical proposition is that most people's intuitive idea of evolution is that it's for the good of the group.
Right.
The good of the species, the good of the community.
Or even the organism. Like
or even the organism.
Individual human being or bird or something, but it's not, right?
Even that. So it's and I think partly people are exporting their desires about society. We should all contribute for the good of the group. We should be civic-minded. We should recycle. We should, in the old days, we should rewind our videotapes. Do things for the good of the group.
Yeah.
And people read that onto the animal kingdom.
Right.
And as if the animals have something to tell us, and therefore the animals themselves should be pro-social and altruistic. And to this day, even among scientists who are not hardcore evolutionary biologists, offering their own explanations for the adaptive function of some trait, will say, well, this helps the species survive.
Right.
Or
and everything fits together for the greater good as I define it.
Exactly. Yes.
So this is a radical decentering of not of evolution, but of the way that evolutionary pressures were kind of put to use by people who wanted certain kinds of social organization or certain types of societies.
Yeah, and I think it leads to a a misunderstanding of one of the most important forces in the history of the universe, namely the appearance and diversification and adaptation of life. But also leads just to a lack of insight into a lot of human affairs. So I'm speaking now as a psychologist. But the idea, and of course what the point of the selfish gene was not that organisms are always selfish. That was the central paradox that Dawkins sought to resolve, namely, given that genes, at least metaphorically, are selfish, how is it that organisms, especially humans, patently are not always selfish? We do make sacrifices. We love each other. We do. We trade favors. We rescue people in distress.
And in a broad sense too. I mean, there was a kind of doctrine of social Darwinism where it was, let's compete all the time because that's what happens in
particular,
nature.
Let's let groups compete against groups.
And Dawkins now, in his most recent book, talked more about cooperation actually than competition.
As he did in the Selfish Gene.
Too,
what made it so so meaty, so toothsome, is resolving the apparent paradox that in humans there's altruism all over the place.
Right.
Given that that isn't done for the benefit of the human species or the benefit of the community, how does that arise? And that leads to some very interesting answers, such as that when it comes to our blood kin, there's some degree of altruism that is built in because any gene for being nice to your sister has a 50% chance of being in that sister and so has a 50% chance of itself being helped. At the same time, if you just do the high school algebra, you discover a non-obvious feature of evolution of parent-offspring conflict. That is, it is not the case that the ultimate interests of the parents are aligned with any given offspring because parents have other offspring, sometimes with other mates, which means that, yes, you love your kids and vice versa, but not as much as they love themselves. And likewise with your siblings. Anyway, that opens up a whole drama, which dramatists have, needless to say, explored.
Suddenly you've given me a new insight into all of the great Roman and Greek dramatists.
Exactly.
Who somehow figured this out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And likewise, when we cooperate with people that we're not related to, there is, as any economist would point out, gains to be had in trade.
Right.
Both parties can benefit if they trade favors as long as the benefit conferred is greater than the cost incurred. Right. But that, again, interestingly, I'm speaking as a psychologist, leads to the whole suite of our moral and social emotions of guilt, of sympathy, of trust, of anger, of forgiveness, which have intelligible roles to play in the altruism and generosity that we see. And in a lot of the contents of our consciousness, what do we obsess over? Oh, I was there for him when he needed a favor, but now that I'm in need, God damn it, where is he? A lot of our ruminations of our fiction is about the various treacheries and generosities that play out in the drama of how we as a species are generous and unselfish, all of which opened up by consideration of explaining the patent fact of human generosity from the substrate of selfish genes. So the story is just, I think, endlessly fascinating and unappreciated by those who glibly say, well, of course, people are generous because that helps the group thrive.
Right.
And in particular domains of psychology that I'm occasionally interested in, like why do we have music? It leads to glib answers like, well, it bonds the group.
Right.
As if bonding the group is what natural selection selects for.
Right. The psychologists are the worst, right? I mean, that's what I'm getting out of this.
They're pretty bad,
The other great part of Dawkins' legacy is his atheism and his advancement of atheism. You yourself are an atheist. I also got to interview him on his farewell tour, and it was interesting because I would say about half of the audience were there because of his atheism, and they were like, oh, yeah, he talks about biology, but who cares? What's the impact of his atheism, and do you think that's been a positive legacy?
I do. He's often portrayed as strident and militant, but his book, The God Delusion, was actually pretty moderate. It patiently laid out, and Rebecca Goldstein in her book, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, did it her way, including the eponymous 36 Arguments included as an appendix to the novel, since they figured in the plot as the appendix to the book by the protagonist. I think it's good for people to see them, especially when I think weak arguments for the existence of God are endorsed by intellectuals, probably ultimately for emotional reasons, since they're terrible arguments.
Right.
So it should be someone's appreciation of the nature of reality, including in contrast to the common accusation that if you're an atheist, you must be amoral, you must be a relativist. And I think a lot of people won't confess to being an atheist because in their mind it's very close to the concept of being amoral. It actually gives us a sound, defensible basis for morality. Namely, it doesn't come from a set of arbitrary commandments, but nonetheless, there really are excellent reasons why we shouldn't kill and exploit and rape each other.
How much of the progress, and you've written a couple of books documenting this, and you continue to kind of update and expand that of going back to 1800 or whenever we want to start the clock that humans are much richer, they are kinder to each other, they kill each other less at scale. How much of that do you think is partly the liberation from traditional, conventional forms of religion?
Some of it. Partly due to just the elimination of religious oppression, such as the stigmatization and punishment of homosexuals, the subordination of women. But even the decline at the idea that the ultimate source of value is the soul, as opposed to the life, means that we ought to, instead of working towards salvation, which also allows you to valorize martyrdom, blowing yourself up for reward in paradise, if the years you have on earth are the only years there are, then it redirects you to making those years as pleasant as possible.
You're going to feather this nest rather than get ready for a kingdom in the sky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It also, I think, forces any institution, any group of people to, if they can't count on scripture commandments, but they are faced with the imperative of living together, what is the rational basis for morality, for social organization? Of course, that's what our founders and framers did in laying out the basis for governance. Self-evident right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness.
They were making an open letter to the world.
An open letter to the world, and crucially based on considerations that everyone could share. If the basis was that America is a shining city on the hill and the greatest nation on earth, you can get some patriots to get behind that. But if you wanted some, say, global organization, if you wanted a universal declaration of human rights, that's not going to travel. Or if Jesus Christ is our savior, that as we now say, is kind of exclusionary. But the crucial thing is it forces you to the realization that what's left over is not nothing. It's not, okay, well then we'll just have a Hobbesian anarchy of everyone fighting for themselves. It turns out that things like universal human rights and freedom and are good things, things that anyone can defend, anyone can accept. And so you've got the establishment of government and other institutions like universities and hospitals and scientific societies and free press based on defensible principles.
Do you worry? I've been hearing lately a lot of people in intellectual classes saying, we need a religious revival. And what's always fascinating to me is that, nobody is saying we need to follow, this this version of Christian teaching or this Jewish teaching or this Muslim teaching. They're just like, we need religion, man, and just all we need is religion. Like, it seems weird that, like, because the religions are kind of mutually incompatible.
Yes. So what we do, I think we can argue that what we could have more of are civic society organizations that bring people together to pool collective action for beneficial causes, raise money for children's hospitals, kind of more, Shriners and Rotary Club. And, they do really good things, and they give people meaning and purpose.
I would
in lives.
love to hear an intellectual say what we need are more Shriner conventions where guys are driving with
fezzes.
fezzes and little cars. Yeah.
Right. But there's a sense in which we do now, and I've been part of some not so successful attempts to come up with secular humanist substitutes for religion.
What is the worst one you've been involved in?
Probably the rationalist solstice in Berkeley, which included hymns to the benefits of global supply chains.
Wow.
I mean, I actually completely endorsed the lyrics of the song, but there's something a bit cringe about the performance.
Okay. Finally, you have a book that's coming out in the fall. It's called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. ... Yes. Common Knowledge and the Science of Harmony, Hypocrisy, and Outrage. Can you do a quick preview for the pre-order people?
Yes. So it's about the concept of common knowledge in the technical sense of everyone knowing that everyone knows something and everyone knowing that ad infinitum, which seems impossible. But we can achieve it when there is some public conspicuous signal that is everyone sees at the same time as they see everyone else seeing it.
What's a very quick example of that?
The emperor's new clothes.
Okay.
When the little boy said the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling them anything they didn't know, but he was adding to their knowledge because now they knew that everyone else knew it. And significantly in the story, that changed their relationship to the emperor. So there are many phenomena in economic life, in political life, in social life that crucially depend on this cognitive state of common knowledge. Why do we accept currency? Because we have faith that other people will accept it. Conversely, why does currency hyperinflate? You lose that faith.
Right.
Why does a bank fail with a bank run, or an economy implode with a depression? Where does political power come from, given that no government has the raw brute force to subjugate every last citizen? Well, it's either people not having the common knowledge to coordinate their resistance, or the government having the recognition by conspicuous public signals that they could apply force.
And let's end on this. What's a good example of that, where people, somebody who's in political power, and it seems like it's always been that way and it will always be that way, and then somebody speaks up and suddenly, and maybe not a tyranny, but like authority just disappears overnight.
Yeah, there are, the color revolutions of the first decades of the 21st century, and the collapse of communism, where once it became common knowledge, that is, once you knew you weren't the only one disgruntled, but you not only knew that there were others, but knew that they knew that there were others. A public demonstration is one way of conveying that, where everyone sees one another. A more recent example in the United States is, why did Biden finally bow out of the presidential race?
Right. He doesn't think he did.
So, yes, he thinks he was deposed.
Yeah.
Prior to his notorious televised debate with Donald Trump, the percentage of Americans thinking that he was not cognitively fit to run again was not that much lower than it was afterwards. So what the debate did not actually convince people that he was in cognitive decline, but everyone realized that everyone else knew that he was, and that made the candidacy untenable.
Are there cases where this revelation of common knowledge, that we share something, where it is productive as opposed to destructive? Because it seems like it's a lot easier. You mentioned the color revolutions, and you can throw in the Arab Spring as well, where this, something wells up and it's like unbelievable, like where people are throwing off a yoke. And then 9 times out of 10, it's, 2 years later, they're back to, it's a different version of the same thing.
Yeah, meet the old boss worse than
the
meet the new boss worse than the old boss.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that is a danger when you simply have, that's just a danger of anarchy as a replacement for tyranny as opposed to, say, democracy.
Right.
And it's not easy to implement a democracy.
Yeah.
But more, there are definitely downsides to common knowledge generation, such as shaming mobs, where one of the reasons that social media have given rise to shaming mobs is that it's so easy to generate common knowledge, where you can denounce a norm breaker in a public forum, or what feels like a public forum, and gain some kudos from your circle at very little cost. And then you get mob rule,
Right.
as played out in fictional contexts like Darkness at Noon or George Orwell's 2 Minutes Hate. So yeah,
Which
it can
now
unleash
we
mobs.
can do in 30 seconds.
Which
right?
we can do in
If we
30
don't have
seconds.
the attention span of people.
Right.
There's
30
blood
seconds,
or whatever.
yeah, that's true.
So, Stephen Pinker, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much for talking to Reason.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.